October 17th, 1941. Bletchley Park, England. The sprawling estate outside London had once been a country retreat, a quiet place for rest and reflection. But now, it had become a hub for Britain's most vital war effort. Hidden within its ancient walls, the nation's best minds toiled day and night, trying to decipher the encrypted messages of the enemy. The work was tedious, complex, and shrouded in secrecy. The Bletchley codebreakers were the invisible soldiers, their names unknown, their victories uncelebrated. Henry had never thought of himself as one of those soldiers. He wasn't even part of the team, officially. He had been hired only a year ago, a simple janitor tasked with keeping the place clean, the floors polished, the wastebaskets emptied. He was no genius, no mathematician. His work was mundane, his world confined to the corridors and back rooms. Yet it was in this quiet, unassuming role that he began to notice something no one else did. Something that would, in time, change the course of the war. It was during his evening shifts when the patterns started to emerge. He'd walk through the hallways, pushing his cleaning cart, wiping down the glass and furniture. The codebreakers were always locked in their rooms, scribbling feverishly, muttering to each other. Their jargon was a foreign language to him. Talk of enigma, bomb machines, ciphers, and algorithms. But every now and then he would catch a glimpse of the papers they left behind, discarded, neglected. Little things, small inconsistencies that didn't seem to belong. One evening, as Henry emptied a trash bin near the main cryptography room, he noticed a scrap of paper stuck to the side. It had a strange string of letters written on it. Nothing like the formal encrypted messages he had seen before. He studied the letters. They were out of place. Too simple. Not encrypted. It was a code, but not one he recognized. He kept the piece of paper in his pocket, unsure why. Maybe it was the strangeness of it, or maybe just the fact that no one else seemed to care about it. Over the next few days, he found more pieces like it, odd, fragmented sections of papers that seemed almost like puzzles with missing pieces. They were discarded carelessly, ignored by those who were supposedly experts in the field. As he swept the floor near the walls where the cryptographers worked, he overheard them talking about breakthroughs and dead ends, their frustration palpable. But none of it seemed to answer the nagging thought in his mind. What was wrong with the code? Why did it feel incomplete? One late afternoon, Henry overheard a heated discussion between two of the lead cryptographers, a woman named Margaret and a man named Peter. He had come to trust their words, their frustrations, even though they never seemed to look at him directly. They were too focused on the work. Margaret's voice broke through the hum of the room. "You're not seeing it, Peter," she said, her tone sharp. "The system's not as secure as we think. There's a vulnerability, too many inconsistencies. We need to push harder." Peter, who had the aura of someone used to solving complex problems, shook his head. "It's impossible. We're missing something. Maybe the encryption's perfect, and we just haven't found the key yet." But Henry could hear something in their voices, an undercurrent of doubt. They were missing something. But what? The next night, after the building had emptied and the cryptographers had retreated to their homes, Henry found himself drawn to the cryptography wing. He knew it was risky. He wasn't supposed to be there, and the guards didn't take kindly to janitors wandering about. But something urged him to investigate further. Something told him that he was on the edge of discovering something monumental, even if he didn't quite understand it yet. He spent hours in the back office, poring over the discarded papers. As he hunched over the desk, scribbling down the fragments and trying to make sense of them, a feeling of realization crept over him. These weren't just random scraps. They were part of something larger, something broken. There was a flaw, a pattern in the way the letters repeated, in the way the cipher seemed to fold in on itself. Henry didn't know the technical jargon, but his instincts told him that there was a shift, an anomaly that others had overlooked. It wasn't about the brilliance of the encryption. It was about the assumption that the code was flawless. The most dangerous thing in intelligence work wasn't the enemy's tactics. It was the belief that you had everything figured out. And that, Henry realized, was the paradox of the situation. The code had been designed by the smartest minds in the world, and yet it had a weakness, a flaw too simple for them to notice. The next day, he couldn't let it go. He spent his break time trying to reassemble the pieces he had found. He had no idea what it all meant, but there was something thrilling in the discovery. He began to recognize a pattern. It was as though the cipher, at a certain point, began to repeat itself. It was a circular motion, an endless loop, one that felt more like a mistake than a design. Henry knew he couldn't do this alone, but how could he explain what he was seeing? He was just a janitor. No one would take him seriously. But he couldn't ignore the urgency of the discovery. In the back of his mind, he wondered if the war effort itself hinged on someone seeing what he had seen. As the days passed, Henry's suspicion grew. The more he worked with the papers, the more convinced he became that the solution was right in front of them, hidden in plain sight. The experts were too focused on the enormity of the task. They were consumed by the complexity of the encryption, but they couldn't see the simplicity of the mistake. One evening, as he walked through the halls, a thought began to solidify. If he could just demonstrate it, if he could show them the flaw, he might be able to make them see it too. He didn't know if anyone would listen, but in his heart, he felt it was worth the risk. There was something profoundly human about it, something timeless. People would overlook what seemed too obvious, too small to matter. But Henry couldn't shake the feeling that, once the code was broken, the history books wouldn't remember the man who found it. After all, how could they? He was just a janitor. November 3rd, 1941. Bletchley Park, England. The cold, gray afternoon descended over the grounds like a curtain, the light fading too quickly for Henry's liking. He shuffled through the corridors with his cleaning cart, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had become a constant companion. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant murmur from the cryptography rooms seemed to echo in his mind, reminding him of what he had uncovered. What had started as a casual observation had transformed into something far greater, something terrifying. The idea that the Enigma code, the code that was supposedly unbreakable, might have a flaw gnawed at him. He couldn't stop thinking about the odd fragments he had found, the inconsistencies buried within the ciphers. It was as if, somewhere in the web of encrypted letters, there was a crack, a tiny imperfection waiting to be noticed. But how could he, a janitor with no formal training in cryptography, possibly hope to decipher it? He kept working, quietly at first, scribbling notes in the margins of his own papers, reassembling the fragments of the discarded documents when no one was looking. He didn't understand the full complexity of the encryption system, but he didn't need to. The pattern, the repetition, seemed clear enough. Something was wrong with the code, and it was right in front of them. He had already seen it once, but he needed to prove it. He needed to show someone, anyone, what he had discovered. It was late one night when he finally decided to take the risk. The building was almost empty, save for a few of the more dedicated cryptographers working through the night. Henry had always admired their brilliance, their obsession with the task at hand. But he couldn't help feeling like they were missing something vital. The truth was in the details, in the small anomalies they had ignored. He had already pieced together enough to know that there was something fundamental wrong with the way the code was being interpreted. He waited for the perfect moment. The guards were stationed at the main entrance, and most of the cryptographers had gone home for the night. Henry, taking a deep breath, slipped into the back cryptography room. It was almost too quiet. The room bathed in the soft glow of desk lamps. He knew he was risking everything, his job, his reputation, perhaps even his life, but the thought of the puzzle, the pattern, was irresistible. With careful hands, he began to spread out the scraps of paper across the table. The letters, the strange strings, the odd anomalies, they all began to make sense when placed together. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was the code itself, but it had been overlooked. There were gaps, places where the code didn't follow its own rules. It was a flaw, a small mistake that no one had noticed. Henry worked into the early hours of the morning, the weight of the discovery pressing on him. He could feel the adrenaline surging through him, but with it came a deep unease. What if no one believed him? What if his findings were dismissed, like everything else he had found? The thought of walking into the room the next morning, telling them what he had uncovered, made him sick to his stomach. He wasn't supposed to know this. He wasn't supposed to be in these rooms, piecing together things that weren't meant for his eyes. But he couldn't stop now. He had come too far. By the time the first rays of dawn touched the windows, Henry had managed to map out a portion of the code, showing where it broke down, where the repetition happened, where the expected randomness fell apart. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Enough to prove that there was something they had missed, something right in front of them. The next morning, as Henry pushed his cleaning cart down the hallway, he tried to steady his nerves. He had to speak to someone. Someone had to listen. But the prospect of approaching one of the cryptographers made his stomach churn. They were too busy. They had no time for a janitor's concerns. Still, he knew that if he didn't act now, the opportunity might slip through his fingers. The war was still raging, and every day that passed without this discovery being acknowledged was a day lost. As he entered the main cryptography room, Henry found himself standing in front of Margaret and Peter. They were hunched over a table, their eyes fixed on a series of encrypted messages. Henry swallowed hard and took a step forward. "Excuse me, he started, but his voice caught in his throat. Both of them looked up, their expressions unreadable. For a moment, the silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Peter broke the tension. "What is it, Henry?" His voice was patient but distracted. I think I found something. Something with the code. A flaw," Henry said, his words tumbling out in a rush. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "A flaw? Are you sure?" "I don't know much about encryption," Henry said quickly, "but I think I've found something in the pattern. It doesn't follow the usual rules. There's repetition. It's not perfect." Margaret exchanged a glance with Peter, her expression skeptical. "You're a janitor, Henry. This is a delicate matter. We don't have time, for I know," Henry interrupted, his voice firm. "But I've seen it. I've been watching. The code, it's not like they think. There's something off. Please just look at it." The cryptographers looked at each other, then back at Henry, as if weighing his words. There was a long pause, filled only by the hum of the machines around them. Finally, Peter spoke again. "Fine. Show us what you've got." Henry's heart pounded in his chest as he quickly retrieved the scraps of paper from his jacket pocket and laid them out on the table. Margaret and Peter leaned in, their eyes scanning the notes with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. At first, they didn't see it, but then Margaret paused, her brow furrowing as she traced a sequence of letters with her finger. Peter joined her, his expression changing as he began to realize what Henry was pointing to. The flaw was subtle, but it was there, an anomaly, a tiny imperfection in the system they had all assumed was perfect. That's impossible," Margaret murmured. Peter stood up abruptly, a look of disbelief on his face. "You're right," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "This could change everything." For the first time in months, Henry felt a flicker of hope. He had done it. He had found the flaw. But even as the realization began to settle in, a new thought struck him, a thought that gnawed at the edges of his mind. If he was right, if this discovery was as significant as it seemed, would they ever acknowledge it? Or would it be buried, just like everything else he had ever found? The thought lingered in the air, unanswered. April 12, 1942. London, England. The city hummed with the steady beat of wartime life, a rhythm defined by tension, hope, and an ever-looming fear. In the quiet, dim-lit rooms of the British intelligence offices, the discovery that had once seemed so insignificant now felt like the pivot point of history. Henry's findings had reached the ears of those who mattered. Finally, and now the cogs of bureaucracy were grinding slowly but steadily in his favor. But nothing about this felt like victory. Henry stood in a sterile office, staring at the large oak desk in front of him. The room was far grander than anything he'd ever imagined entering. The walls were lined with maps, a picture of military strategy, yet the weight of his discovery felt heavier than the entire war effort combined. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't an officer. He was just a janitor, a man who had never been seen, who had never been invited into the real fight. And now, after all the sneaking, all the furtive glances and quiet nights spent poring over code that was never meant to be touched by his hands, he was standing in front of the men and women who held the fate of nations in their palms. They had acknowledged the flaw in the Enigma code. The vulnerability he had found in the most closely guarded secrets of the Third Reich was real. Henry had been right, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed as though his name might be written into the annals of history as the man who helped Britain change the course of the war. But as quickly as that thought formed, it faded. The real truth hit him in the pit of his stomach like a heavy stone. The men and women who were supposed to recognize his contribution weren't looking at him. They were looking at the data, at the breakthrough. They were looking at the numbers, the machine, and the system that had allowed him to find the flaw. But they weren't looking at the janitor who had done the work. Henry was presented as a humble footnote, a name scarcely mentioned amid the larger, more prominent figures in the cryptography team. His contribution was acknowledged in a brief meeting, a thank you from the powers that be, but there was no fanfare. There was no recognition of his sleepless nights, his quiet persistence, or the fact that, in a world of elite mathematicians and brilliant minds, it had been a janitor who saw what they could not. The message was clear: a janitor could solve the code, but a janitor could not be a hero. Heroes had titles, degrees, and names in the newspapers. The day after the meeting, Henry returned to the same halls he had cleaned for months, his heart heavier than before. The corridors, which had once felt like a maze of opportunity, now felt cold, indifferent, and filled with whispers. His discovery had turned the tide in a war that had claimed millions of lives. Yet here he was, a man whose name would never be spoken beyond these walls. The cryptographers who had first dismissed him, who had ignored his warnings, now smiled at him with polite recognition, but their eyes never held the depth of gratitude he had hoped for. It was as if he were invisible once again. In the weeks that followed, the information he had uncovered was used to crack the codes of the enemy, to save countless lives and shift the balance of power. Henry's work, though invaluable, was quickly swallowed up by the tide of war. The intelligence community moved on, as it always did. They would celebrate their own victories, crediting their machines, their innovations, their brilliant minds. But Henry? He was just another cog in the machine, his name erased from the story that was being written. The public would never know about the janitor who had cracked the code. His discovery was buried in the archives, filed away as a piece of history that no one would care to remember. And why would they? He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a decorated officer. He wasn't a codebreaker by trade. His legacy was too simple, too quiet to be noticed by the world outside. Even in the quiet corners of Bletchley Park, Henry knew that his place would be forgotten. He went back to his duties, mopping floors, washing windows, and taking out the trash. The rooms were full of faces, many of whom he had never spoken to before, all of them with grand titles and grander ambitions. They were the ones whose names would be etched into history. They were the ones who would stand in front of crowds, hailed as the heroes of the war. And Henry, despite having contributed to the very fabric of their success, would never see his name beside theirs. The irony weighed heavily on him. The code that had once seemed so indestructible had been cracked by someone who was never meant to touch it. A janitor, a man whose only job was to clean up after the real workers, had been the one to see what they could not. He had discovered the flaw in their system, exposed a weakness they had missed, and yet they would never truly acknowledge him. The paradox hung in the air, unspoken. The outsider had succeeded where the insiders had failed. But in the grand narrative of war, his contribution was as fleeting as a shadow, disappearing the moment it was cast.